Venture Capital, Part 2. So, we're on the second stage of our journey. We've learned about angel investing. We learned about how to present. We've learned about how to network. And so we're going to learn a little bit more about venture capital before proceeding to the next stage, which is years 3 to 4. And so we're going to learn a little bit more about venture capital this class, and we're going to talk about the history of venture capital, which is fascinating, and we'll give you a really good understanding as to why Silicon Valley has been incredibly innovative for many, many years. It's important to study history to a certain extent, to understand what drives corporations or individuals like Steve Jobs to change the world. So let's get started. The history of Silicon Valley is absolutely fascinating, and it has to do with the threat of war, with the Cold War, where the U.S. was at war with the Soviet Union for years. It has a lot to do with landing the first person on the moon, and it has a lot to do with the hippie movement. The hippie movement at Berkeley, which is a great university here in the San Francisco Bay Area, changed the world. All these elements together changed the world, and it really is fascinating. So we're going to go through this. So venture capital in America was born due to the Cold War. It's fascinating. So the DNA fabric of the United States is really based on extremes. Now, this is not a criticism, as I do love this country, but you have to really understand the history of warfare and the Cold War and the hippie movement in order to understand where innovation comes from. Okay, so there's going to be 3 parts to this class, or the historical side of venture capital. Part 1 will be about war. Part 2 will be about peace. In part 3, I'll put war and peace together, and you'll get a better appreciation as to why Silicon Valley is a vibrant place when it comes to innovation. Okay, so let's kick it off with part 1, war. So in order to really understand venture capital or innovation in general, you got to understand that the genesis and kind of historical context of all the geopolitical events that caused the venture capital sector to emerge in the first place. Okay, so American fear of Russia is the only reason that the venture capital industry exists. And I'm talking about fear of Russia from the 50s up until the Berlin Wall really fell. Now, pardon me, the post-World War II catalyst, the catalyst that created venture capital is both war and peace. Which, interestingly enough, is a very famous book as well. But war and peace helped venture capital to emerge. And so fear and the Cold War really led to the creation of the internet. And we touched on this before. If nuclear bombs were to hit the center of America, God forbid, the East Coast would still be able to communicate with the West Coast, leveraging the internet. And so the internet actually was a big government contract. In fact, a lot of the technologies we use today are due to government military weapons research, as bizarre as that sounds. I'll give you a couple of examples. So all of these brands exist because of government funding of weapons to compete with Russia. And that includes Cisco, Intel, Google, Amazon, although it's in Seattle, Microsoft, although it's in Seattle, Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, 2 great San Francisco companies, and even the whole notion of Bitcoin, which no one really knows where the headquarters are. But all these brands only exist because of government funding of weapons research to compete with Russia. Okay, and there's a big pushback as well on this, and we'll get to that in a second. It's fascinating. Okay, so America was absolutely terrified of Russia and Russia military might. And so what happened was America invested in weapons research, which led to the invention of many technologies. And I'll give you some more examples because this really is interesting. GPS, which we all use in our cell phones for when we use map navigation, was created from guided missile research. The database where all information is stored it exists only because of the CIA's Project Oracle, which was Oracle's first customer in the 1970s. The microchip was actually financed by NASA so that NASA could put the first person on the moon before the Russians could. And Palantir, which is the largest employer right now in Palo Alto, even larger than Facebook. Palantir was financed by the CIA's venture capital division. And for those of you that haven't heard of Palantir, it's this amazing software company here in the Bay Area that is solving the world's biggest problems. In fact, the Obama administration would not have found Osama bin Laden if it weren't for Palantir software. So it's artificial intelligence-based software that solves the world's biggest problems, founded here in the Bay Area because of government research. Okay, and we all know about the web being created because of issues with potential nuclear warfare. And so, again, competing with Russia is the only reason the venture capital sector exists. And here's a famous quote from Khrushchev saying, "We will bury you," which scared the heck out of many of us, of course. Russia, as many of you know, had nukes or warheads maybe in Cuba, and the U.S. almost launched nuclear missiles against Russia at that time. It's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Under the Kennedy administration. This will all make sense to you in a second while I'm mentioning all this. And so as children, even for me in Canada, my mom living in Canada, we expected nuclear bombs to come from Russia over Canada and to hit the United States. And so what happened was there were these idiotic infomercials on television sponsored by the U.S. government, which helped to fund the war research. There's one called Duck and Cover, and basically, if a nuclear bomb were to hit, you're supposed to get under your desk, as if that's going to save you. I don't want to go too far off topic, but if you want more information on the whole Duck and Cover nutty cartoon set, just go to YouTube and do a search on Duck and Cover. And so when I was a kid, actually, back in the 80s in Canada, there's only a couple TV stations we had, ABC, NBC, CBS. And I remember one day there was this movie that came out that scared the hell out of us. And it was called The Day After. And The Day After was about nuclear warfare with Russia and who launches their missiles first. It doesn't matter because we all, anyway, get blown up. But do a search for The Day After on YouTube if you want more information on that. And so even the original Planet of the Apes movie, which was really popular when I was a kid, was about astronauts lost in space, and they came back to America to find that the whole country the whole world actually had been decimated by nuclear weapons. And there's one scene at the end where you see the Statue of Liberty, and Charlton Heston's on the beach saying, you bastards, you murderers, you blew it all up. And so the Cold War and competition to compete with Russia is one of the reasons that many great technologies exist. So anyway, a little bit of background. So that's enough about war. Okay, let's talk about happier stuff like peace. Okay, this is part 2. So war plus peace equals venture capital. And so in the late 60s, an incredible thing happened. Youth in San Francisco rebelled. And if you want, you can watch the movie Forrest Gump for kind of a history on this. It's fascinating. So youth in San Francisco rebelled, and they chanted, "Make love, not war," in places like Haight-Ashbury, which is a street corner in San Francisco. And so that the peace movement was created to counter the war movement in the United States. And so these kids, or 20-somethings that were in university in Berkeley and other great schools across the country in the late 60s, all they had known in their life was war. Their parents had fought in World War II, their grandparents in World War I, their brothers were getting killed in this stupid war in Vietnam, all about the Cold War. And so the peace movement kicked off in the Bay Area, which led to innovation. Bear with me, please. Okay, so they marched at Berkeley, they marched at Stanford, they held incredible peace events at Telegraph Tower, which is downtown San Francisco. These people shared everything. Shareable open source software was born at that time, which is the notion of kind of sharing information and not trying to only make money off it, but giving information away for free. So Stanford even got rid of all of its government weapons research on campus. So in the 1950s, 50% of Stanford's R&D budget was highly classified military weapons research. Terrible. And so what happened was the students at Berkeley found out about this. And in the late 60s, the Berkeley students got together with the Stanford students. And the Stanford students actually took over the university, took over Stanford. And the reason they did it was because, again, half of their R&D at the university was government military weapons research. And so the administration of Stanford, which is a great school, said, "We're sorry. and they pushed all that research stuff off-site, SRI, Stanford Research Institute. And then what happened was an open source movement created, whereby teachers and students started creating business models and sharing ideas. And you don't find this anywhere else in the world, right? And I'm not throwing the rest of the world under the bus, but because of the conflicts between war and peace here in the Bay Area, this open source or this sharing of everything movement was created. And so it created a very vibrant economic environment here, or like a fertile Tigris and Euphrates, to the extent that there's a fertile Tigris and Euphrates technology crescent, and people started sharing ideas here. It was kind of a new movement, and so Stanford let students and teachers create their own business models and profit from them. And then Sandhill, which is a street right beside Stanford University in Palo Alto, became relevant, and that's where all the big venture capital firms are. It's kind of like Wall Street, which is in New York, but Sandhill is, of course, here in San Francisco Bay Area, and it's only for startups. And so the counterculture movement was born. People experimenting with drugs. Actually led to the invention of the personal computer. That generation didn't trust anybody over 30. They really despised the war-focused movement of the day, and good for them. They're my heroes. And so what happened was they were very inspired by music, right? And so you could see that with Steve Jobs, with his Think Different commercials with Bob Dylan and John Lennon. And so music inspired entrepreneurs, like Steve Jobs. And like Paul Allen, who was the co-founder of Microsoft. So music actually had a big part to do with a lot of success. Fascinating, isn't it? And so these entrepreneurs were former hippies, and they really thought differently from their parents. And they embraced change, thank goodness. My mom and dad, they were dating in the 60s, and somebody saw my dad walking with my mom on Yonge Street in Toronto and said to my mom, "You should be ashamed of yourself." And so interracial marriage, as messed up as this is, it was actually illegal in 13 states in the 1960s. And so there was this one seminal moment, which was awesome, which was Captain Kirk had the first interracial kiss on television in the late 60s. So the 60s was a time of cultural breakthrough, a forward-thinking people to kind of rebel against their parents. And these heroes were ready to change ideas and change the world. And so on the left coast here, they thought, hey man, it's cool to fail. Just kind of keep trying. Just think different, as all ideas and all people are really accepted here. And again, a fertile Tigris and Euphrates technology crescent was born here out of evolution and revolution. And these events haven't really occurred anywhere else in the world yet. And I think it's because America is a country of extremes. And I'm not saying that Americans are better innovators, because they're certainly not, but people that come here tend to be very successful innovating, and more than 50 or 60% of all the best entrepreneurs here in Silicon Valley were born overseas. And so I hope you understand and kind of appreciate the eclectic mix or conflict between war and peace that led to the birth of Silicon Valley.